In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, a quiet tension hung in the air, a stillness that belied the monumental storm about to break upon the shores of occupied France. As the morning mist clung to the choppy, gray waters of the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled in human history set its course for Normandy. This was Operation Overlord. This was D-Day. The Allied forces, a grand coalition of nations united against the tyranny of the Third Reich, were about to embark on a crusade in Europe, a pivotal and perilous gamble to turn the tide of the Second World War. The fate of millions, the very future of freedom itself, rested upon the success of this immense and complex undertaking. For the soldiers huddled in the landing craft, tossed by the unforgiving sea, the theoretical had become terrifyingly real. They were on the precipice of history, staring into the face of an unknown and violent destiny. The armada that crossed the Channel was a sight of staggering scale and power. A floating city of nearly 7,000 vessels. Above them, the skies throbbed with the incessant drone of over 11,000 aircraft, a steel canopy preparing to unleash its fury and deliver paratroopers deep behind enemy lines. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the gloom, the designated beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword emerged from the haze. But the German defenders. The initial moments on the sands of Normandy were a brutal, chaotic baptism of fire. At Omaha Beach, the reality of the German resistance was felt most acutely. American forces faced a landscape of death, a killing field raked by blistering, overlapping fields of fire from well-sighted German emplacements on the high bluffs. The preliminary naval and aerial bombardment had proven tragically ineffective, leaving the defenses largely intact. Men were cut down in the water before they even reached the shore. The first waves were decimated, their ranks torn apart, equipment lost to the waves, and leadership structures shattered in an instant. The beach became a grim tableau of chaos and courage, littered with the wreckage of war and the bodies of the fallen. Yet, amidst this maelstrom of destruction, leaders emerged. Small groups of soldiers, often led by junior officers or non-commissioned officers, began to rally. They crawled, climbed, and fought their way through the wire, up the shingle, and toward the bluffs. Inch by agonizing inch. Their progress was slow and paid for in blood, but it was progress nonetheless, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The fight for Omaha hung in the balance for hours, a desperate struggle against a wall of steel and fire. Simultaneously, along the other four beaches, the battle for Normandy raged with varying degrees of intensity. At Utah Beach, the American 4th Infantry Division found themselves fortuitously landed in a less defended sector, allowing them to push inland with comparatively lighter casualties, and link up with the airborne divisions dropped behind the lines. On Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces fought their way ashore against significant, and at times ferocious, opposition. The Canadians at Juno Beach faced some of the heaviest resistance outside of Omaha, battling through heavily mined waters and fortified seaside towns. Yet, through sheer determination and coordinated assaults, they managed to secure their objectives and push further inland than any other Allied force. On that first day, each beach told its own story of struggle and sacrifice, of tactical successes and harrowing setbacks. The operation was not a single battle, but a series of brutal, interlocking engagements, each one critical to the overall success of the lodgment. The foothold in Europe was being established, not by a grand, sweeping maneuver, but through countless individual acts of valor and brutal, close-quarters combat. The D-Day landings were the dramatic opening chapter, but they marked only the beginning of the end of the Second World War in Europe. The initial beachhead was fragile, a narrow strip of liberated soil fiercely contested by the enemy. The days and weeks that followed saw the grueling Battle of Normandy, a brutal war of attrition fought in the dense hedgerows, or Bocage, of the French countryside. The Allies had to fight for every field, every village, every crossroads, against a determined and experienced German army. The cost of this campaign was immense, with casualties mounting on both sides. Yet, The successful establishment of the beachhead was the turning point. It opened a vital second front, forcing Germany called upon to do the impossible. They were factory workers, farmers, teachers, and clerks, drawn from the towns and cities of America, Britain, Canada, and nations across the free world. They were young men, many of whom had never seen combat, who faced their deepest fears as they stepped out of the landing craft and into the inferno. They were the pilots who flew through flak-filled skies, the sailors who navigated treacherous waters, and the medics who braved the battlefield to tend to the wounded. They were also the members of the French resistance, who risked torture and execution to provide intelligence and sow chaos behind enemy lines, paving the way for the liberators. This immense human effort, this collective will to stand against tyranny, is what transformed the course of the 20th century. Their actions were a powerful affirmation that in the darkest of times, the courage of individuals, united in a common cause, can indeed change the world. To stand on the beaches of Normandy today is to stand on hallowed ground. The morning mist still rolls, and from the sea the ocean still roars against the sand. And the quiet hum of the wind can feel to the thoughtful observer, like a distant echo of the aircraft that once filled these skies. The concrete bunkers, silent, stand as stoic witnesses to the violence they once unleashed. Rows of pristine white crosses and stars of David in the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking the sands of Omaha Beach, stretch out in solemn, silent tribute. Each marker represents a story cut short, a future unlived. It is here, in the profound quiet of these final resting places, that the true cost of freedom becomes achingly clear. The scale of the sacrifice is almost incomprehensible. Thousands of lives given in a single day. Tens of thousands more in the campaign that followed. They made this ultimate sacrifice not for conquest or glory, but for a world where liberty could endure. The legacy of their courage is not confined to the pages of history books or the frames of old newsreels. It is a living inheritance, a torch of remembrance passed down through the generations. We remember them in the solemn ceremonies held on these shores. We're veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, stand alongside world leaders and grateful citizens. We remember them in the stories told by families, in the medals and letters kept as sacred heirlooms. We remember them so that we never forget the price that was paid for the peace and freedom that so many now take for granted. The soldiers of D-Day asked for nothing in return, save that we build a better world upon the foundation of their sacrifice. Today, as we look back upon that fateful June morning, their courage continues to inspire, a timeless and powerful reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit and the profound cost of liberty. Their memory is etched not only in the sands of Normandy, but in the very fabric of the free world they fought to save. The victory on the beaches marked only the beginning. As the Allies pushed inland, they encountered a far deadlier explosions with little effect. Then, under the cover of smoke, the infantry would have to advance across the open ground, exposed to withering fire from defenders they could not see. Reaching the opposite hedgerow was only half the battle. They would then have to fight their way through it, often in savage, close-quarters combat using bayonets and hand grenades. The psychological toll was immense. The constant tension of not knowing where the enemy was, the sudden eruption of violence, and the sight of comrades falling in the fight for another identical-looking field, created a state of perpetual fear and exhaustion. An American officer grimly noted that the campaign had become a war of privates and sergeants, where small unit leaders had to make life-or-death decisions in an instant, fighting 100 tiny, isolated battles for every yard of ground gained. It became brutally clear that conventional methods were failing. To break the stalemate, the Allies needed to innovate, to develop new tools and tactics on the fly. The most significant challenge was the inability of their tanks, primarily the M for Sherman, to effectively support the infantry. When a Sherman tried to drive over a hedgerow, its thin underbelly would be exposed, making it an easy target for a hidden German Panzerfaust*. If it tried to crash through, it would often get stuck, its tracks churning uselessly against the solid earth. The solution came not from a high-level command, but from the ingenuity of an anonymous soldier, Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen. He devised a set of steel tusks, fashioned from the wreckage of German beach obstacles, and welded them to the front of a Sherman tank. These simple but brilliant the base of the hedgerows, creating a breach for both the tank and the infantry following close behind, simultaneously. New infantry tactics were developed, hedgerow drills were created, coordinating tanks and infantry in a combined arms approach. A Rhino tank would smash a hole in one corner of the hedgerow, while machine guns suppressed the opposite end, allowing infantry to pour through the gap and clear the field from the flank. This marriage of mechanical innovation and tactical adaptation began to finally turn the tide. With the advent of the Rhino tanks and the refinement of new combat doctrines, the pace of the Allied advance began to quicken. The stalemate was finally broken. In late July, after weeks of grinding, attritional warfare, the American forces launched Operation Cobra, preceded by a cataclysmic aerial bombardment that shook the very earth. Thousands of Allied troops and hundreds of Rhino-equipped tanks surged forward, tearing through the German lines that had held them for so long. The Bocage nightmarish battle of the hedgerows was drawing to a close, and the road to the crucial city of Saint-Lô, the capital of the ruins, was now open. The Allies had paid a staggering price in blood and treasure for every yard of Normandy as green hell, but they had overcome the terrain, outfought a determined enemy, and were now poised to break out into the open country of France, ready for the next great push toward the heart of the Reich. In the sweltering heat of late July 1944, the Norman countryside was a graveyard of ambition. For 7 agonizing weeks since the D-Day landings, Allied forces had been bled white in the dense, suffocating hedgerows of the Bocage. Each field, each sunken lane, was a miniature fortress, fiercely defended by a determined and experienced German army. The advance was measured in yards, paid for with a constant stream of casualties. The initial euphoria of the invasion had given way to a grim, grinding war of attrition. But within the Allied High Command, a plan was taking shape, a plan born of desperation and ingenuity, designed not merely to push the enemy back, but to shatter his front line completely. It was a gamble of immense proportions, a single, decisive blow to break the stalemate. This was the genesis of Operation Cobra. A carpet of high explosives rained down upon the German positions. The earth buckled and split, trees were vaporized, and the intricate network of trenches and machine gun nests that had stalled the Allied advance was systematically obliterated. The bombardment was a cataclysm of smoke, fire, and concussive force, so violent that it registered on seismographs in England. For the German soldiers caught in this maelstrom, there was no defense, no escape. They were simply erased from the landscape, their positions pulverized into a moonscape of overlapping craters. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical destruction, leaving the survivors dazed, deafened, and utterly broken. As the last bombs fell and a pall of dust and smoke choked the air, the ground assault began. Leading the charge were Sherman tanks, but these were no ordinary Shermans. Many had been fitted with a simple yet revolutionary invention, the Rhino modification. These were great steel tusks, fashioned from German beach obstacles, welded to the front of the tanks. Where before the hedgerows had been impassable barriers, the Rhino-equipped Shermans could now tear through them with ease, crashing through the dense earth and foliage to create breaches for the infantry to follow. This innovation, combined with new tactics that emphasized combined arms cooperation, allowed the American columns to surge forward. Infantry and armor worked in concert, bypassing isolated strong points and maintaining a relentless forward momentum. The static, grinding warfare of the Bocage was suddenly, dramatically replaced by speed and shock action. The initial penetration was swift and brutal, catching the dazed German defenders completely off guard. The German command structure, already strained by weeks of attritional combat, began to collapse under the weight of the assault. The Panzer-Lehr Division, which had borne the brunt of the aerial bombardment, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Communications were severed, command posts were annihilated, and units were cut off and isolated. Reports reaching German headquarters were confused. Branches at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula fell, and with it, the gateway to Brittany and the heart of France was thrown wide open. The long, bloody struggle for Normandy's fields and villages was finally over, replaced by a war of movement and exploitation on a scale not seen since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. Operation Cobra was more than just a successful battle. It was a pivotal turning point in the war. It marked the dramatic and decisive end of the brutal stalemate in Normandy and unleashed the Allied armies to begin the liberation of France. The fighting had transitioned from a slow, grinding war of attrition to a swift, lightning-fast war of maneuver. The German 7th Army was effectively encircled and annihilated in the subsequent Falaise Pocket, a catastrophe from which the Wehrmacht in the West would never fully recover. The road to Paris, and ultimately to the Rhine, now lay open. The breakthrough, forged in the fire of the aerial bombardment and driven home by the ingenuity of the Rhino tanks, had transformed the strategic situation overnight. The collapse of the German lines near Saint-Lô was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich in France, a decisive moment when the tide of the campaign turned irrevocably in favor of the Allies.